Greetings, this is Script Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with my next Asimov short story review. And again, 2 in a row are Foundation stories. The previous, which was The Big and the Little, and now this one, which is a relatively small or short story, because John Campbell requested a short story, titled The Wedge. It did not get the cover, but this is the magazine it came in. But it did, it is of course in the table of contents, which appears as, here we go, short stories, The Wedge, by Isaac Asimov, page 64. Again, no more table of contents blurbs. So, 64, you see both the artwork and a short publisher's blurb. You see here, there's a scene where the guy uses some sort of element transformation through nuclear power to turn iron into gold. And he holds out this belt buckle that had been iron is given to him, and now it is a piece of gold. So, the caption reads, "Gold's funny stuff, perfectly useless so far as practical work goes, but the men of the Foundation could make it do things in the psychological political field." Illustrated by Kramer. Okay. So there's a few other pictures. We have a picture here of the Grand Master in his chair, kind of bent over, and a very thick collar, like a big donut around his neck. Okay, and that's how the Grand Master dresses in this world of Askone. Okay. Then we have one more picture, and that is when he's all done, the ship is escorted by other ships going out of the system. And so that picture will probably go in a lot of places. Okay. So this story is fairly short. It about 7,000 words roughly. And it was did not involve a Selden crisis. It only involves what appears to be a small trading victory. There's this world, Askone, which already has its own religion, something that opposes everything atomic or nuclear powered, other than what few leftover relics were left from the days of the Empire, which amounted to a few ships, ancient spaceships, nothing terribly significant from a war potential standpoint, but a few small cruisers, and that was it. If it isn't from the Empire, it's not atomic. Atomic is not allowed there, and so forth. Well, this, of course, gets in the way of the whole idea of the Foundation trying to spread itself. Although, well, here's where things get a little bit different. Although the story is the same, basically, the protagonist of the story finds a way. Well, he's got two things he's got to do. He has a friend named Askone who attempted to initiate trade with Askone and was thrown in jail for trying to sell them atomic gadgets, which, by their religion, they don't want to buy. So that's Askone. He's in prison, and they're thinking to execute him, but our guy here is going to try to rescue Askone and maybe carry out successfully the sale of atomic gadgets, which basically he does by finding a pretty clever way of pressuring one of the members of the, well, not the Grand Master, but of the great board of people who control the planet. So somebody who would have been the most difficult to convert, but ends up having a certain greediness for gold, and, well, anyway, I won't pursue it much further, but let's just say it's successful because our trader that the story primarily revolves around is extremely successful. The bigger question and the interesting one is, who is this trader exactly? Which also has to do with the role that this story has in the whole Foundation series. As originally written, it is set clearly after the time of Hober Mallow. The religion is something only for the Four Kingdoms. That's it. Now we're expanding in a new era. Hober Mallow has begun a new era of expanding their influence through trade, through selling their atomic gewgaws to gadgets to new planets that can't make them, but the Foundation can, and so forth. And so that creates, a lot of real convenience, but at the same time independence on Foundation products. So that's the new story created by a situation created by the previous situation, the big and the little. So now we're using trade, in effect, to kind of break down the planet of Askone's religion. Not preparatory to establish a Foundation religion, but merely preparatory to establishing trade with Askone, and this is just another somewhat more interesting planet and a clever thing. Well, it did one other thing. As originally published, the protagonist, our main trader, is none other than Lathan Devers, who, of course, is far more famous for being the Foundation trader we see throughout the next one, which is where the Foundation takes on the Empire directly. And that's where the Foundation must win out against the Empire. And so, rather than spend any time introducing Lathan Devers in that story, we've already met him here in this story, so we know how clever he is, we know what a trader he is, and how brilliant he is, and so forth, and how resourceful and so forth. So he's got all this good stuff. If anybody in the Foundation could do something helpful towards dealing with the Empire, it would be him. So we've met him here, and that's the main purpose of this story. We see how clever he is, and then presumably some maybe 5, 10, no more than 20, probably less than 20 years later, maybe 5, 10, 15, whatever years later, the actual confrontation with the Empire occurs, and he's ready, he's capable, he is the guy, the man of the hour. So of course he would be the one sent out to be the point man for the Foundation, if you will. Major change of purpose, function, role, place, and therefore character for the book when it got put into the first volume of Foundation. So when it got put in there, it got renamed. What was called the Wedge originally gets renamed the Traders, which is something smaller scale than the Merchant Princes, which now Hober Mallow's section would become, as it now goes to the end of Volume 1, ends it on a strong note with Hober Mallow successfully navigating the Foundation through a Selden crisis. See, in this one there is no Selden crisis. So now we have to put this in a different place historically. When we go to the book, it becomes something that took place 20 years before Hober Mallow. Obviously, there's no way Lathan Devers is going to go through these adventures, live for 20 years more. Hober Mallow comes along, overshadows him, I guess, and he's still around however much even beyond Hober Mallow that the Foundation finally meets up with the Empire. So it has to be somebody else, and the character of Limmar Ponyets is introduced instead. It's purely a name substitution change in terms of changing the text. But there are other textual differences that make this story fit very differently. And yet surprisingly little has to change, because basically you have this clever trader, whether it's Lathan Devers as originally conceived, or now Limmar Ponyets, who is now here still functioning in a time where the Foundation religion is still the basis of their influence over the planets. It hasn't gone beyond the 4 kingdoms, but maybe, just maybe, they want to expand into Askone. Only, so now it becomes like just this barely beginning of, let's start looking at trade without the religion. But now the reason it also kind of becomes, first of all, Askone already had its own religion. That was part of the story. And it would be made later. The idea was that, and it's got inserted into the big and the little when it went to the book, the idea was that gradually the Askone religion was either morphed or replaced by the Foundation religion, which then made it like the Four Kingdoms, almost like a fifth kingdom, but it's pretty much just a small planet by itself, unlike the Four Kingdoms that were full bona fide kingdoms of some number of planets, maybe a dozen or two or three per kingdom, and Creon and Smyrna being the two main ones, and the other two's names seem to vary. I'm not sure why. They don't seem to be too important, but there's always four of them. So, but in this different role, so now it becomes that it's still part of the use of the religion, but you couldn't use it directly because the Askonians already had their own religion, so you kind of had to separate your trade from that, meaning we're getting a little taste of doing the trade without the religion, which would then be kind of preparatory or introductory to a trend that Hober Mallow would then be completing and bringing to maturity by now having trade be the whole direction that the Foundation will take in spreading its influence. So there are a number of differences, some of them simply from adding the Encyclopedia Galactica, a couple of minor things for pulpish writing, or else the addition of a short explanation. And then there's a fairly significant change in one small section that gives the story's different context. So let's start here. Originally, the story, let's see, I've already read the publisher's blurb on the first page. The story headed off with a short quote from Salvor Hardin. Never let your sense of morals prevent you from doing what is right. This little thing is expanded into a whole entry from the Encyclopedia Galactica. And the entry traders. Okay, and it says, and consistently in advance of the political hegemony of the Foundation were the traders, reaching out tenuous fingerholds through the tremendous distances of the periphery. Months or years might pass between landings on Terminus. The ships were often nothing more than patchquilts of homemade repairs and improvisations. Their honesty was none the highest, their daring, though through it all, they forged an empire more enduring than the pseudo-religious despotism of the Four Kingdoms. Tales without end are told of these massive, lonely figures who bore, half seriously, half mockingly, a motto adapted from one of Salvor Hardin's epigrams: never let your sense of morals prevent you from doing what is right. It is difficult now to tell which tales are real and which are apocryphal. There are none probably that have not suffered some exaggeration, and so on by Encyclopedia Galactica. So the whole thing starts off with, originally it was Lathan Devers was completely a lather. He was covered with soap suds. And because it's a classic stereotype message, this is when somebody, the phone rings when you're in the shower or the bathtub and you're wet and you can't go to it, And so they're kind of basing it on that, kind of starting this off with that kind of humorous anecdote. So Lathan Devers was completely a lather. Well, that kind of the sentence reads kind of amusing in its way it's written, and gives it that humor. The humor disappears when now it becomes Limmar Ponyets was completely a lather. So the bathtub gets turned to a shower and going from one to the other. That's not too big of a deal. Okay. Now here's a big description here. He's managed to talk the Askonian board members into allowing him to meet up with and talk to the other Foundation guy, the trader, who was already there, Askone, and in prison for trying to sell them atomic gadgets. He did this by persuading the Askonians that he was some kind of a priest, which, unlike most traders, apparently Lathan Devers or Limmar Ponyets, take your pick, had originally trained as a priest, and then later on was just too wild and crazy and secular to really have any business being the priest, and he switched over to a secular education and then went on to become a trader. So, and they're kind of reviewing stuff. This is also kind of a way of bringing in, here's what's gone on, in the past, or provide a little context for the story. So it's like a little bit of backstory in case you haven't read the earlier installments. Once again, Asimov is finding this clever way of incorporating a bit of the backstory, a recap, if you will, right into the text of the story without making it too obtrusive. So he just does it in a simple conversation that Lathan Devers / Limmar Ponyets is having with Askone in prison. So it's originally presented, it went like this. Okay, it's simple enough, Gorov spoke rapidly and in a whisper. Here it is. The Foundation is creating a commercial empire here in the periphery. The foreign policy revolves around that. We have the only source of atomic power available except for such relics of the old empire as still exist. Every system, then, whose economic backbone we can convert from chemical and mechanical energy to atomic energy becomes totally dependent upon us. Devers was nodding. That I realize. I'm a trader. Right. And that's your reason for existence. Organized trade for the Foundation at present can exist only with worlds relatively near. You traders are the outposts, the wandering peddlers that reach regions we couldn't otherwise for centuries, perhaps. Your wedges, is the title of the wedge. Understand? You introduce gadgets, little atomic doodads that open the way, increase the desire, whet the appetite. The trader grinned. Stop, you're breaking my heart. It's so, Gorov was not grinning. And conversely, going back to the argument, any system that refuses to accept atomic gadgets is dangerous to us. Yeah, because such a system can never be under our economic dominion, and because it can act as a focal point for hostility. So it's quite clear that, as originally posited, the context is we have gone from this religion thing to trade. But, and that's how we're operating. When it went into the book as the traders, a small section inserted now before the merchant princes, before the big and the little, before Hober Mallow, this little conversation proceeds like this. It's simple enough, said Gorov. The only way we can increase the security of the Foundation here in the periphery is to form a religion-controlled commercial empire. We're still too weak to be able to force political control. It's all we can do to hold the four kingdoms. Ponyets was nodding. This I realize, and any system that doesn't accept our atomic, or later on in later editions nuclear, gadgets can never be placed under our religious control. And Gorov finally completes this. Yes, and can therefore become a focal point of independence and hostility. Yes. So now this changes the whole context of the story. So we talk about an anarchic period 2 centuries previous. Now it becomes a century ago, because we've actually moved this, time and place forward about a century. Let's see. There's a past where, originally it talks about a wedge to start the wedge towards economic domination. Wedges within wedges, huh? And they send you, and I'm to ransom you. They send you, Gorov, and me, I'm Lathan Devers, to ransom you. And the other newer one just says, and they send you for that purpose. Well, I'm only here to ransom you, says Limmar Ponyets. Okay. Rather odd sort of, I think it's a typo, or I'm not sure what was meant. Basically, he was going to trap one of the members of the board by having transacted with him to sell a little machine that makes gold that he demonstrated. And it's like, you don't have to tell anybody where you got your gold. Here's your machine. And he's going to set this thing to go off and show everybody what happened. Imagine how many power brokers could be just totally undone by having their little supposedly secret negotiations suddenly made public, or even the threat of the same. So that's actually interesting stuff. So for some reason the first was actually made as a threat that was actually empty. He says, no, that sounded good, but I really had one in the palace courtyard which didn't sound as impressive but was more dangerous, really. And that just becomes, no, they didn't matter. Okay. So now it concludes with a question of, you've got no sense of morals. Have you no sense of morals? Well, you know what Salvador Hardin says about morals. So, as you can see, it's really surprising, a few other very minor grammatical things. But nothing that really changes anything of significance. So, as you can see, it's not a big story, it's a small story. And if you put that at the end of the first of the 3 Foundation volumes, very anticlimactic. Like I said, the real value of that is only as originally presented. We're introducing the character of Lathan Devers, who will then go on to be a factor is very important in the next story, wherein the Foundation takes on the Empire. Well, but you don't see that at the beginning of the first Foundation volume, so it just ends with this minor trading victory after the great climax of Hober Mallow's navigation of the third Selden crisis. So it just made sense to change its function, invert the order of the 2 stories, and now this is just a beginning, a little trading victory that established the idea that maybe you could do trade without pushing the Foundation religion. Well, at least not immediately. Like I said, in the book version, in the Merchant Princes, it's claimed that afterwards, over the last 20 years from then to Hober Mallow, you see gradually the Foundation religion is established. And so anyway, thanks for listening. That's what there is on that.